All right. So now we're going to morph into this discussion around the IPCC. So the IPCC is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And there's a final plenary session which is actually a moment of high drama. So if you're in the business of doing science and you're a bit worn out, I'd get onto an IPCC committee and you make sure you're at the highest level of IPCC so you get to go to the final plenary session. And because it does have moments of high, I've been through two, it does have moments of high drama, which are exhilarating and you can remember them for most of your life. So I'm not going to spoil my story by talking about the final plenary yet, though. So I made a flippant comment a little bit earlier about Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan. Now, Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan were friends. In the 1980s, late 1980s, there was a lot of interest, especially driven out of the UK, but also out of the USA, which was around the question of climate change and what we should do about it, and is it a real problem? So the World Meteorological Organization, the United Nations Environment Program, got together to create, partly because of the UK and the USA, but also because of Bert Boland from Sweden, to create a thing called the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And so why is there the word intergovernmental in IPCC? Well, Greenpeace, non-government organisations like that have a bad reputation. And so I think basically those two, President and Prime Minister of the UK, Margaret Thatcher, basically concluded that we could exclude them if we make it an intergovernmental report. So it's a report to all governments on behalf and for governments. So actually, the documents we create aren't for you guys. Therefore, so it's important to actually remember that. It's actually for the United Nations and it's for all of the participating governments in the United Nations. That's what those reports are for. They're not for actually your consumption, although obviously that's an important part of the process. So IPCC has a little secretariat. There's a bureau that helps to support the IPCC chair. So the current IPCC chair is actually from Korea, South Korea. The last one was from India, and the one before that was from USA, and before that UK. So it gets shared around. And these people are actually voted into that through a very interesting and not exactly transparent process by all of the countries that are involved in the IPCC process. As distinct from the rest of IPCC, which is very transparent, by the way. The Bureau is there to help them. And then basically, and the structure is the same for the fourth and fifth assessments. So I think it's almost the same for the sixth assessment. We have a working group 1. Now, the working group 1 is what I've participated in. It basically includes the science of climate change. So actually, in many ways, it's uncontentious. It's uncontentious relative to some of the other areas, okay, put it that way. Now, working group 2 is all about the impacts of climate change. So in theory, what you can see is that these guys would be informed by the science. They'd figure out the impacts and what the adaptation response ought to be. And then working group 3 is structured around emissions into the atmosphere and what you need to do to actually mitigate those emissions. So how to turn the current rising level of emissions into zero emissions into the future. What is the cost of doing that? What are the processes that you might have to do it? And then this one here, which won't be in the sixth assessment, which is around national greenhouse gas inventories. Australia's signed up to this actually, and each year we publish our national greenhouse gas inventories, whether we're going up or down, and this becomes part of the global products that come out of the UK, from Norwich, led by Henry Quere, which has the global carbon budget. And that's actually quite a fascinating story that's emerging around current emission pathways in the Earth system. So these 4 groups basically report as part of the first, second, third, fourth and fifth assessment reports, going from science, the impacts, mitigation and a few other things. Okay? So if you think about it, really in some ways this group is providing information to this group, and this group is providing information in some ways back to this group, and to policymakers, right, to policymakers on what we ought to do and what the costs of it will be. Working Group 2 is actually the most challenging working group to be in. It's the most challenging one because it's the one that tries to understand what the consequences of climate change would be on cities, for instance, or what the consequences of climate change would be on agriculture. And so they don't have a global perspective, and it's really hard to make a really coherent narrative about those consequences on climate change. And so it tends to be a bit less scientific, if I can put it that way. These guys are very scientific, and so are these guys. Now, the other thing is, actually, IPCC doesn't do science. That seems an odd thing to say, right? You guys do the science. You guys write the papers. What the business of this, thing is to do is really to do an assessment of the science. It's writing a review almost, right? It's writing almost a review, but not a review. So it doesn't commission science directly. So there's just some science that's kind of created, because as you come together at the various working group meetings, you actually have a lot of conversation with some really bright people who have got some control on levers and resources. And so actually they go, oh, that's a good idea. Oh, that's a gap in our analysis. We don't have an answer to that. And so some science is spontaneously created, but there's no commissioning of science by the IPCC. IPCC, in spite of my comments about how this chair appears, is actually highly transparent. Highly transparent. Now, you guys, when you publish a paper, you write it, you send it in, you have 2, 3, occasionally 4 reviewers. You revise your paper. No one sees the comments to the reviewers. You address them. It gets accepted, and the paper is published as a unit, right? It's all, and you probably hate it at various different times, right? You know, it's a bit arduous. Sometimes the reviewers are painful, that kind of stuff. But the good news is that your reviewers come out of the scientific community, typically, right? And they are genuine experts. In our case, it's the other way around. What we have is a huge number of genuine, fantastic, highly respected experts. We, on the chapter team, have to respond to every comment. We have to document exactly how we change the text in response to those comments. Okay? You have to document it. And then we make it public. Right? So actually you can go through all the changes that we made on our chapter and you can analyse it. And people do. They trawl the commentary. They work out the dates. They figure out when this was changed, when that was changed. Why was that changed? Oh, actually that change was after the plenary where it should have been agreed. That was a highly contentious issue in the 1990s when some things were slightly changed after the fact. And people got onto it and they gave them grief, although they might have been done for perfectly good reason. This transparency has led to PhD programs around the analysis of the revisions of the documents and so on. You don't believe it, it's absolutely true. And it can be reviewed by anybody. And by anybody I mean it can be any sceptic, it can be anyone who's got an axe to grind, as long as they're at least qualified. They're qualified in the sense that they might have been an engineer, they've had a history in doing quantitative science of some kind. It's also reviewed by government. Now you think, oh yeah, governments want to change things and do things in different ways. It's true, sometimes they do have an axe. It's kind of interesting, but it can work both ways. And I think I'll talk about that for a little while. So in our case, we had some co-chairs. These co-chairs are actually the most important people in the delivery of a successful report, okay? And we had Thomas Stocker, who some of you will have met, I think, and Data Kim from China. He's still around, actually, doing good science. So we have the co-chairs, and then we have a support unit that drives the activity. And the support unit's getting less and less money, and so we're being a bit squeezed there. And it's done on a very small budget in reality. So the question you might ask is this kind of activity actually really worthwhile to policymakers? You know, well, why else would you do it, right? So the first thing is you've got to wrap your mind around it. I know you guys are superb scientists and you read all the literature. And in the case of our chapter, we had 1,500 peer-reviewed papers. Across the report, we had 10,000. So you've all read those 10,000 papers, right? And actually, the average policymaker's got tons of time, so he would read them too. And so IPCC would be irrelevant, right? We wouldn't need it. Actually, that's part of the problem. The problem is the scale of the literature around climate change. It's extraordinary. 1,500 for my chapter alone last time around. 10,000 papers in the whole volume. This is sort of an impossible load. And this is why it's an assessment. You're trying to condense 10,000 papers. And they're all exciting, so you definitely want to read them all, right? And down to the messages. So that straight away is a fantastic thing to have done for policymakers. But then there's actually this kind of perverse problem where actually the literature is a bit sparse. There are some areas that aren't covered, actually, that are entirely relevant to what you want and you know, for what you need to know about. So the real problem is no one can know all the climate science, so that's the first problem. So that instantly tells you that actually we've got to be collaborating all the time. Collaboration is a driver for all of this task. This Centre of Excellence puts a lot of emphasis on collaboration. It's the same for IPCC, and it's the same for driving this narrative around climate science and understanding it. It's incredibly important to distill the science into chunks, right, that you and I can understand, actually, and policymakers can understand. It's got to be, I say uniform language, actually, so it doesn't help if you have one chapter using one kind of language and the next chapter using another kind and the next one using another kind and so on, right? So you've got to kind of distill up a lot of the language and try and make it more uniform. And in fact, we spent quite a lot of time doing that. It's important that it's actually credible, right? If you're going to distill all this stuff down, it's got to be, for it to be believable, it has to be credible, right? It's got to be credible. If it's not credible, then it'll be ignored, right? So it's got to be credible. So what does that mean, to be credible? Actually, it's got to have some classy scientists on it. That's part of the credibility. The second thing is it's got to be actually reviewed and tested and worked over by both governments and experts that are outside of the author team. It's actually, to be credible, it's got to be up to date, so it's got to be the current state of knowledge. And really, you've got to get rid of the crap, right? You know, there's often a lot of literature out there that's not really relevant to the task at hand, and there's a sort of a strange set of assessments around, because we're publishing on the halo of knowledge, whereas actually we want the robust, solid part of the knowledge, which is what is driving the policy making. So what you guys is publish at the edge of knowledge, but actually what these reports have to be is about the state of knowledge from the community. And it's got to be policy relevant, actually, so it's kind of irrelevant in some ways if there's no climate signal in it. But maybe solar is important, and maybe the hiatus and ice sheets and sea levels and forcings. It's the things that we care about that actually will affect the future in the science. And then what's policy relevant in Working Group 2 would be how it will affect agriculture and so on. So this is what the policy makers want, right? And this is what makes it worthwhile for policymakers. Policymakers are kind of this nebulous people out in the crowd, but actually really that's all the governments of the world. In this case, it's all the governments of the world. And the problem, of course, and why are policymakers interested, is actually it's really around how do we make a sustainable Earth. And back in the 1980s, there was this sort of optimistic, happy world where we actually thought about these things really seriously. And so we formed United Nations formed the framework for the Convention on Climate Change. And that convention came out of the Rio meeting, and that convention wasn't just about climate change. It was actually about supporting ecology and biodiversity on the planet. So Australia has an act called the EPBC Act. The EPBC Act came exactly out of the same meeting that the United Framework, this convention came out of, and a few other things. They're global things that are about actually supporting and sustaining the Earth, maintaining the ecosystems, the biodiversity of the Earth, and so they actually part of that era where we thought we could actually really make a sustainable Earth. I think we can. But it was actually a bit of a heroic time when we actually were thinking very strongly about that on a global scale. Now, this treaty, which is actually across all of the United Nations countries, leads to these Conference of the Parties. When our last Paris Conference of the Party was the COP21 meeting. And that led to the fantastic agreement that we have that Donald Trump has just pulled out of, right? That agreement is actually an exciting agreement. It's a genuine attempt to actually reduce the temperature change on the Earth to 2 degrees. The pledges that came through the COP agreement only do 3 degrees, by the way, so not enough. But there is a discussion about 1.5 degrees, so mitigating climate change to 1.5. And that comes out of that. And the reason this agreement is interesting is because it's got a review process and allows the countries to actually adapt and change their emissions strategy with time, depending on how they're tracking. So it's got an adaptive response to it. So that agreement is actually really good. Kyoto was the forerunner agreement, right, which 50% of countries did sign up to, 50% of emissions. Now, if you think about this thing and you think about climate change, these are really important reasons. But have you ever thought about the top 100 countries, top 100 companies in the world? You look at that all the time, right? That's worth a book. There's some obvious ones, Google, Apple. But actually, the other 80% are energy companies, right? Coal, nuclear, fossil fuels, and so on. And what it tells you, when you look at those top 100 companies, is that actually the carbon dioxide, burning of carbon dioxide, the use of fossil fuels, is actually huge business. It's a huge business. And because it's a huge business, and which we all depend on, the actual removal of CO2 out of the removal of CO2 as an emission product from our human activities is actually an enormous task which goes through the entire society. I say that because we all forget it, right? You know, it's obvious climate change is happening, but it's got to be contentious for exactly that reason. It's got to be contentious because we all use and emit CO2 all the time. All the top 100 companies are there. So it's a huge problem, this question of addressing climate change. And if you looked at the last carbon budgets, the carbon emissions from China, for instance, last 3 years has turned over, going down. America, actually it turned over and going down. India is still going up. It's quite a lot lower. the world actually stabilised on emissions in the last 3 years. So there's something going on which is fascinating in the emissions space, but the policymakers need these reports to actually kind of drive the scientific conversation around what society should be doing, okay? And there are lots of competing interests. So it's really important we have these rock-solid scientific documents around climate change. So, for the research community, I did a postdoc with Carl Lynch many years ago, and he'll tell you that IPCC, it takes up so much of the research energy activity that it really just ruins the climate, it ruins oceanography. They've suddenly got no more oceanographers left because they're all doing climate science for IPCC. It's a waste of time, right? So there's one view. And the science isn't changing that fast anyway. You could do it every 20 years. So, of course, if you imagine it every 20 years, okay, put out a report, 1980, maybe the next one will be 2000, 2020. Actually, there'll be a lot of own goals kicked in the meantime, right, because it's not frequent enough. But he'll also say, oh, look, science doesn't change. It's unchanged. And actually, I was, as often happens with older people, they've all done it before, right? And the problem is that they think that nothing's changed, whereas actually the science has always moved. And the science across the whole of climate science, the exciting things going on in the ice sheets of Antarctica and Greenland are so important. Actually, we've got to be reporting on them almost yearly because the estimates are coming out that fast. The ocean heat content story is changing on a 5-year time period. So actually a lot of it, not everywhere, a lot of it is actually changing fast enough. But actually the positives for you and me is that actually the collaboration stimulates the analysis of climate change. It gets it into the conversation, by the way. There was a story where actually on the cut-off date for one of the various reports, suddenly there was this flood of climate change science papers that came into the editorial offices that they had to, because you have to publish by a certain date, right, to get it through. So there was so it did drive a lot of science into the editorial offices of the journals. But it actually simulates a lot of new work, ice sheets, these questions around attributional or fractional risk in climate change for flood and heat waves. It drives the new analyses around oceans and ice sheets, and it actually brings people together to think about the Earth system collectively, and that are the things that I think have been extraordinarily valuable. So if you can participate at some point in the future, I'd do so, or something similar. So what was involved, actually, because it's a bit onerous? Well, we went to a scoping meeting in Venice. That was nice. We identified a lot of new science, actually, and the science that needed, and we probably didn't do too badly on that. And the scoping meetings are happening currently for the next round of AR6. There was one in Ethiopia just a few weeks ago, and there was one for the special report on oceans and cryosphere in Monaco in late November, early December. In AR5 we had a special meeting on sea level because we understood that we needed to drive a bit of the scientific thinking around sea level. Sea level is a big issue in the climate change space. So this is back in 2009. We had these special meetings. 2010 we actually selected lead authors like myself and coordinating lead authors, so that you're nominated. You actually get there on merit. They can reject you at any time, they can accept you at any time. And then we had various meetings. There was 4 in total. There's a zeroth order draft, a first order draft, a second order draft, a third order draft, each of which has comments from experts. So there's hundreds of thousands of comments on each of these that you read and find. And then there's these final drafts. And then finally, there was the summary for policymakers. That summary for policymakers is actually the one that really matters. And then we had a plenary session in Sweden in September 2013. It's kind of exciting actually, because what happens is the press start camping outside your building. And in the 2007, we suddenly get accosted by journalists trying to sneak information out of you. And then what would happen is some people, of course, would tweet what's going on during the meeting. So there was quite a lot of interest in this one, and actually there was even more interest in 2007. And the summary for policymakers is really interesting because United Nations requires consensus. So it's not just a vote, it's not by Parliament or anything, it requires consensus. Consensus means everybody agrees. Everybody agrees, right? So think about that. And we agree to the words line by line. And if you don't agree to something, it just goes on the floor. Okay? So you've got 4 days to do it. So if it's not agreed, then in the case of ours, the projections is in the last half. So if you only get halfway through, all the information around projections is just left on the floor. Okay? So it can be cutthroat. It's done in 4 languages because that's the way United Nations works. So it works the language thing. So some people are really excited. This guy won a real Nobel Prize. He's famous. He's actually worth following on tweets. He is worth following on tweets. So IPCC is a remarkable example of mobilising expert analysis, that's exactly what you mean, to inform policymakers. Actually, that's exactly what it's all about. Our Australian of the Year thinks it's a little bit different. And he's got some truth there. I talked about uniform language, right? Just imagine you've got this collaboration of 300 lead authors, another 600 contributing authors. It's really important to actually be able to talk around things that you can understand. So where you can calculate probability, virtually certain, 99% probability, very likely, 90%, likely, 66 to 1,000, so likely is not 50%, 66. About likely is not 33. So you can see this calibrated language that is developed actually to help understand things. And we also had assessments which were quite qualitative. It's actually okay not to be able to calculate everything, not to be able to turn everything into a probability. Words, at the end of the day, are what we use, okay, to communicate. And so we talked about a calibrated language, which is where actually, if there were 50 papers, I wish there were 50 papers, if there were 5 papers and they're all in agreement, even if there's only 1 or 2 pieces of evidence, then your assessment would say, oh yeah, it's high in agreement and it's low in robustness. I've forgotten what this axis is. If there was lots of evidence and it was they were all in agreement and there was lots of evidence and there was a lot of agreement, then you have robust evidence and high agreement. So we actually worked out kind of a scale that we followed. And these qualitative confidence language was actually really important where you can't do a quantitative assessment of the risks and probabilities, okay? So there was a tendency to use that kind of language. IPCC was very much a team effort. So this was my lead author team. You can see there's a mix of people. This is Miles Allen Wright, so he's super famous. And this lady here, Gabby Hergel, has recently become a fellow of the Royal Society. She is another key driver of the science around detection and attribution. And then there's the 2 co-chairs, Peter Stott, myself, and then there's the rest of us. And you'll notice that there's this gentleman here, he was from Zambia, where the internet's not so fast actually, and this lady here was from also an undeveloped country in Africa, although she's of Indian descent. So there's a mixture of people in the team, sort of reflecting United Nations concepts of equality and diversity and representation from a variety of countries. They're a wonderful team. Well, Yep. So, this is what a chapter would look like. There was 15 lead authors. So here we are. We're managing a team of something like 83 people. All right, just to make up 35 A4 pages of text, 1,500 references. We had 700 reviews. We don't talk about the zeroth order draft. That was a special secret draft. Remember, we're transparent. That was just to test whether we were thinking right. Then we have the first order draft, 700 comments that we responded to. Second order draft, 1,200 comments. Third order draft. I got RSI actually out of this. This was fine. So it actually, it can hurt you physically, all these kind of comments. This was so I've forgotten what this total of 10,000 is. I'm trying to remember what that is. These are the reviews. Anyway, there was 10,000. Oh, yeah, I know what this is. Okay, so this is the number of emails I did around IPCC. 2011, 2012. 2012 was a light year. 2013. So there was more than 10,000 emails that I did, that I wrote. Right? These are what I sent around the IPCC task. So in AR5, we had 209 people plus another 50 contributors in reviews, and another 600. So there's about 800 people involved in this assessment across the full 500 chapters, full 500 pages that are written. It's a huge activity. You can see why Carl Wunsch thought it was a waste of time. There were 38 governments involved in the review, and there were actually more than 100 governments that came to the final plenary session. So here we are in Sweden. So this is the Australians. So you had John Church, you had me today, Scott Power. Did Scott present this winter school? No. Scott Power and Stephen Took. So Australia had 4 coordinating lead authors at the Sweden assessment. That's more than any other country. Hobart actually had 3, which is more than any city in the world, coordinating lead authors. And Anthony Swirapik here, Neville Smith, some of you will know Neville Smith, were the Australian government representatives, and I've forgotten this lady's name, but she was here to support these 2 gentlemen. So they were on the other side, they are the government, right, and we're just the honest scientists who are just controlling the discussion around the science. I've already told you the story about Margaret Thatcher and why there's the government in intergovernment. And it is heavy-hitting stuff. The Prime Minister of Denmark came to one of the meetings we had in COP19. This is the Minister for Environment in Sweden. Sweden takes great pride in the efforts it's made in mitigating for climate change. They are very active and have a huge history in the story around climate change. This is a picture of Thomas Stocker, Kin, and this is Rajendra Pachauri and the Secretary of IPCC, somebody Christie, and I'll think of her first name in a moment. This is the opening session, so actually this is all very pleasant, and it's before the hard yards. So the key thing here is we've got the summary for policymakers. The summary for policymakers is what the governments agreed to in the plenary session for 4 days. And you have to agree to it line by line. Even the text, tables and figures, okay? And they will want to alter the text table, and sometimes they actually agree to add a figure, right? So they actually want more graphics. Policymakers that want more graphics, we love them. And here's a human influence in the climate systems sphere. We spent a lot of time working up these words in advance. Consensus means consensus. So everybody, every country has to agree. Every country, even Saudi Arabia, even the Germans. So, because they're two ends of the world. Right? The Germans are really onto climate change. The Saudi Arabians, maybe not so much. They have a vested interest. Brazil, they all have to agree. Surely you'd think this was unstable. Right? How can you get that many countries to agree? So there's the observations, we talked about that. There's the strengthening of the evidence. These are the big statements that are made. Extremely likely human influence has been dominant. Actually, this sentence was amazing, right? This, in the fourth assessment report, we actually had a moment, and you can see it as a footnote. If you ever wonder why there's a footnote in the summary for policymakers, it's because in that instance of China was the dissenting voice, actually. China was the dissenting voice. And we got to the point where they would, if they did not agree, we would have lost the whole sentence that said that human influence wasn't dominant, right? That's a powerful statement. That it was very likely that human influence had caused half of climate change. We would have lost that sentence, which is a key sentence if you think about it. You don't have a sentence that says humans caused it. Why are you bothering with this report? And we had this tussle for about half an hour, and then finally the Chinese agreed to a footnote. And there was sort of a little mistake made in the way we phrased up the footnote, but they agreed to that too, which was to our favour, by the way. And as soon as they kind of agreed, they gavelled the sentence down, and we all kind of sighed in relief because every one of us scientists sitting at the front, right, with 100 other countries sitting behind you, were actually worried.
What does it say?
And in the footnote it says something like, I've forgotten, it's almost irrelevant, you know. Almost irrelevant, because no one looks at footnotes. The theory of a footnote, no one looks at it. But actually, so that was the fourth assessment. But in the fifth assessment, this sentence went straight through. No one queried it. No one, we were kind of waiting. Gavel, gavel, that one, gavel, gavel. All the human influence sentences went straight through. So actually, in this assessment, it wasn't about humans. It was actually, well, how much do we have to mitigate by? So it actually came later down. So it's funny how different issues. You had a question?
Yeah, I was just wondering, with these more controversial ones, is getting that consensus when some people are clearly not on board.
Yeah.
Is that primarily a diplomatic process, or is it a let's go back and look at what the report says on a scientific process?
So we had a negotiation. I'll tell you about a negotiation we had. So there was a sentence that we had to work on. One sentence which involved. It was about human influence in the climate system, so we kind of worked it out a bit before we actually gavelled it out. And so we had the Germans. We all were there. We had the Germans. And the Germans are really into climate change, and they really want to mitigate against it, right? And then we had the South Pacific Islands, the Pacific Islands, the low-lying islands, right? Of course, they're absolutely threatened by climate change, and so they're standing there and they're saying we've got to increase the level of language here. We've got to shift it from extremely likely, and not just 50%, all of it. And you know, because they want the message to go out, and so we're looking at these guys, and then we had the Saudi Arabians, and there was another country there, and we were standing here discussing the science. Peter Stott and I was there, and we were saying, well, look, this is what the science says. This is what the chapter says. We went back to the chapter. It says this. And the Germans would say, and the Pacific Islands say, oh, we've got to get it higher. And the Saudi Arabians said, look, we think this process sucks, actually. That's what they said to us. And then I said, well, we went through the science again, and then they said, okay, if that's what the science tells us, we'll take that. They didn't want to change the words. So they were happy to accept to that level of work. They didn't want to go beyond the science. That was kind of what the Germans and the South Pacific Islanders were trying to do. They were trying to push us a bit beyond where we were comfortable as scientists in our interpretation of what existed. I said to the Saudi Arabian, "Are you happy?" He said, "No, I'm never happy with this whole process." But they accepted the science, right? And so that sentence got gabbled down. And so there is a negotiation to tweak some of the words in some places. And we actually had a whole section where we went off because they couldn't get agreement. And then they came back a day and we agreed to a slab like that in one go. Yes, so there can be quite intense because it has inbuilt. That one we agreed on, that's a marvellous headline, and I've already talked about that. So on the third day, we had one day to go, right? So time is here. And here's the words that have been gabbled down the creek. Day 3, right? We only have 4 days, by the way. It turns out in the morning of day 3, this is end of day 3, maybe I'm exaggerating. What we did is we added on day 3 another session of the night, right? That gets us a few more hours. And so we worked through to about 11 o'clock and went home. And then the next day, we added another session in the evening, and in fact, some people worked through the entire night. Now these two guys, Gabby and myself, we're working hard too, because you can see we're still listening to the 4 different languages. We're on the ball here, and you can see the other groups working away during very late in the evening. And this man who I showed you here, he had a sleepless night, and I remember we were agreeing to the words and he was reading them out. He has a bit of a prompter in front to make sure he's organised. But he was asleep and reading the words at the same time. And you can do it. I saw him do it. We did have to sort of jog him a little bit when he get him back on to the right words because he slipped off a sentence. But, it's seriously fatiguing stuff. But we got there. And so this is the next day. The room is filled with all of the world's press, basically. And what had happened? 110 nations were in that room, in that same room, right? And they all agreed. And the amazing thing is actually the science is respected and the scientific assessment is accepted. And this man, who hadn't had any sleep that night, and he probably didn't either actually, answered the questions on Friday morning, 9 a.m, and went through the entire summary for Policymakers, which had been agreed to. And we then all did TV interviews and radio interviews around all of the various different results. So I think it's a kind of extraordinary thing to actually produce this document on behalf of the world. Thanks.
I'm running a little bit late, but if we have a couple of quick questions, and then I'll push the start of the next session back a little bit so you've got time to make it.
Yeah.
Is the uniform language for the next report going to be the same?
So I didn't go to, so the answer will be, in all probability, very likely. There'll be some slight tweaks with high confidence.
You mentioned special reports. I was just wondering, wanting a bit more information about them and their role in this process.
Yeah, so in the next round, there'll be a special report on oceans and cryosphere. And it will come out in 2018 or 2019, so it's got a short fuse. It's a special report because they don't get enough pages of coverage, basically. The oceans are barely covered at all. In the third assessment report, there's no oceanography. per se. In the 4th assessment report, there was a chapter on oceans. In the 5th assessment, there was a chapter on oceans, and it's a bigger part. But actually, in the working group too, there was nothing on oceans in the 4th assessment, and in the 5th assessment, there was a chapter on the oceans. So oceans have really been a small part of. So it's a recognised gap. So the special report on oceans and cryosphere is about filling that gap with the latest science, recognising that science is changing relatively fast. There's still the full assessments. There's another special report on what it means to do a 1.5 degree mitigation. You know, can we actually mitigate for 1.5 degrees? What would we benefit from? What would it take in terms of carbon emissions? That's another special report. There's another special report on the terrestrial environment. And then there's the normal assessments, which will come out in 2021. They're there to fill a gap. We had one around extremes in the last round. They're shorter, thinner, of the moment things. I'm not sure if that answers your full question.
Yeah, I was interested in the plenary sessions and whether that process will continue. So consensus is not usually unanimous. I would have thought. So do you think do you think if that process do you think that makes the process stronger to have unanimous agreement?
That's the way United Nations works.
Right.
It's a United Nations framework. It's a United Nations process. It's a report to governments by United Nations. And all United Nations process work under consensus things. So you've just got an element of what's going on in the various United Nations activities. They all have this consensus. They all agree line by line on the final documents. And this is why you can have utter failure. The Conference of the Parties, is in various previous ones has failed, literally, because we couldn't get proper agreement. So you get these watered down things. So that you get these much reduced statements often because that's what they could agree on. So it can be moribund. It can be moribund. Yeah.
How much of the reports can actually be thrown out then from just nobody agreeing on those sentences?
In the impacts one, we actually lost significant bits of the report because they couldn't get consensus. So it can. It's completely within the rules.
Yeah.
So the curious thing is, why doesn't that happen much more often? And the reason it doesn't happen much more often is because actually there's a communication. The governments have seen that summary. The governments have seen all the chapters. If you've seen it all before, right, and read it 4 times, you should be in a position to actually agree on it and know what it is. And the traceability into the chapters is so strong, it's hard to contest it. Right, because we've written it so it's uncontestable in many ways, because it's just the assessment of the science.
How do you think the process for the preparation of these reports could be improved?
Yeah. There are a lot of sceptics out there around the way the reports are written. And so, can you do it faster or smaller or shorter or have quicker turnaround times and still be as credible, informative perhaps? So you're trading something off, aren't you? You're trading off, and then you've got to go sell it at the end, actually. So you can't do it every year. It's impossible. So you wouldn't do it every year. The ones that you do every year, can you assemble the right group to do it and get the right, and be as tractable and credible? So it's an interesting question. And can you actually, there's no other pathway to government, right? So the governments have to agree to reduce it or change it in some way. There will be shorter reports.
So are there any changes that you would suggest?
I'm being a bit unimaginative, aren't I actually think we need to safeguard the process to some extent. It's a bit onerous. take some parts out of it, but because it's been contested, and people like my colleague at Met Office, he was taken to court. Met Office was taken to the court. It gets challenged, and there are freedom from information requests on all their emails over the entire period, right? And there was the UEA hacking of that. So you can see that actually some of this is about